In war, the first casualty isn't innocence, it's simplicity. The clean, simple lines between good and evil, between right and wrong, they bleed together in the mud and the blood, until nothing is clear anymore. Sergeant Mark Rylance learned this lesson in a sun-baked, forgotten village whose name he could never pronounce. The air tasted of dust and fear. His squad was moving from house to house, a grim, efficient machine of leather and steel. The order, delivered over the crackle of the radio, was simple, and it was monstrous. Intel says the village is a staging ground. No one gets left behind, and no one gets left alive. Acknowledge? Mark acknowledged. In war, you are a function, a tool. You follow the order, you move, you execute, you don't think. Thinking is how you get killed. He kicked in the door of a small clay brick hovel. The inside was dark and smelled of stale bread and charcoal. Empty. He swept his rifle across the room, his training screaming at him, his humanity a gagged prisoner in the back of his mind. He was about to call clear when he heard it. A tiny sound, a muffled sob. It came from a small wooden crate in the corner, partially covered by a dirty blanket. He leveled his rifle, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He approached slowly, every nerve on fire. He nudged the blanket away with the barrel of his gun and looked down into a pair of eyes. They weren't the eyes of a soldier, not the eyes of an enemy. They were the eyes of a child, a boy no older than 7. He was huddled in the crate, his small body trembling, his face streaked with dirt and tears. But his eyes, they weren't just scared. They were huge, dark pools of bottomless terror, reflecting the image of the monster with the gun who had just found him. The order echoed in Mark's head. No one gets left alive. The boy was the enemy. Genetically, ideologically, he was a seed from which a new generation of hate could grow. To kill him was logical. It was efficient. It was, according to his orders, the right thing to do. He was a good soldier. He should follow the order. He looked down the iron sights of his rifle. He saw the boy's terrified face, and then he saw his own son's face, safe at home, an ocean away. And the simplicity of war shattered into a million pieces. He couldn't do it. To pull that trigger would be to kill something inside himself, something more important than the soldier, the man. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his rifle. He looked at the boy whose trembling had not subsided. Mark raised a single gloved finger to his own lips in the universal sign for silence. "Shh," he whispered. He backed out of the hovel, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Anything?" his squad leader called out. Mark Rylance took a breath, and he lied. "Clear," he said, the word feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. "It's empty." As they moved on, leaving the village and the silence behind, Mark felt a strange sense of peace. In a day filled with death, he had chosen life. He had disobeyed an order, but he had obeyed his conscience. He believed, in that moment, that he had saved a small piece of his own soul. He had no way of knowing that his single act of mercy was a beautiful, tragic, and fatal mistake. The war ended, as all wars eventually do. Mark Rylance came home. He put his uniform in a box, along with the medals, the memories, and the ghosts. He tried to bury the soldier and become the husband and father he was supposed to be. He returned to a world of manicured lawns, weekend barbecues, and a peace so profound it felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a dark, churning ocean. His wife Sarah held him with a gentle desperation, as if trying to physically anchor him to this new, safe reality. His son David, who was just a memory in a photograph when he left, was now a real, breathing boy who had to learn the shape and sound of his own father. Mark got a job as a firefighter. It was a good fit. It was a uniform he could wear with a different kind of pride. It was a job where he ran into burning buildings to save lives, not into hovels to take them. It was his penance, his attempt to balance the scales of his soul. But the ghost of the war never truly left him. It was there in the long silences at the dinner table. It was there in the way he would flinch at the sound of a car backfiring. And it was there, late at night, when he would wake up in a cold sweat, the image of a boy with huge, terrified eyes burned into the back of his eyelids. He never told anyone about that boy. It was his secret. A single, defining moment of both shame and pride. He had broken his oath as a soldier, but he had kept his oath as a human being. On his darkest nights, when the things he had done came crawling back, the memory of that one act of defiance was a small, flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. He had saved one. He had to believe that meant something. Years passed. The memories began to fade. The ghost of the soldier grew quieter. Mark's life found a peaceful, happy rhythm. He watched his own son David grow from a boy into a young man. He saw the same spark of life, the same boundless potential in him that he had seen in the eyes of the boy in the crate. He coached David's little league team. He taught him how to drive. He stood proudly at his high school graduation. He built a life, a good one, filled with love and laughter. He had successfully escaped the war. He had made it home. One sunny Saturday afternoon, 20 years after he had walked out of that dusty village, Mark Rylance was at a downtown street festival with his family. The air was filled with music, the smell of popcorn, and the cheerful noise of a city at peace. Sarah was laughing at something David had said. It was a perfect, ordinary moment. The kind of moment he had fought for. The kind of moment he once thought he would never see again. He felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had made the right choice. Life was good. He was safe. His family was safe. In another part of the city, a young man with dark, burning eyes parked a nondescript van on a busy street corner. He checked the timer on the device in the back one last time. His face was a mask of a calm, fanatical certainty. He was a soldier, just like his father had been. He was following his orders. He was a tool of a cause he believed in with every fiber of his being. He had been raised on stories of the monsters who had destroyed his village, who had killed his parents. He had been taught that mercy was weakness and that the only answer to violence was greater violence. The hatred had been nurtured in him since he was a small, terrified boy hiding in a wooden crate. He got out of the van, blended into the crowd, and walked away without looking back. He didn't know the name of the man who had spared his life 20 years ago. He didn't know that this man was here, in this city, enjoying a perfect, ordinary moment with his family. And Mark Rylance didn't know that the small, flickering candle of hope he had protected for so long was about to ignite an inferno that would consume everything he loved. The first sign was a tremor, a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. For a fraction of a second, the cheerful noise of the festival faltered, a confused, questioning silence falling over the crowd. Mark's head snapped up. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in 20 years, but his body remembered it instantly. The primal, gut-level recognition of something fundamentally wrong. It was a feeling that came right before the world tore itself apart. "Get down!" he screamed, his voice no longer the gentle tone of a father, but the raw, guttural command of a sergeant. He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed Sarah and David, shoving them towards the ground, trying to shield their bodies with his own. His actions were pure instinct, a muscle memory from a past life. And then the sound arrived. It wasn't a bang. It was a physical presence, a solid wall of noise that hit them with the force of a tidal wave, shredding the air, shattering glass, and ripping through the happy fabric of the day. It was followed by a blast of heat so intense it felt like the sun had fallen out of the sky and landed a block away. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of screaming smoke and chaos. The next few moments were a blur of disconnected, nightmarish images. The sight of the clear blue sky, suddenly blotted out by a plume of thick, black smoke. The smell of fire and something metallic and wrong. The cacophony of car alarms, of shattering windows, and the high, thin sound of human panic. Mark pushed himself up, his ears ringing, his body scraped and bruised. His training took over, overriding the fear. Assess the situation, find the threat, protect your own. Sarah? David? He yelled, his voice hoarse. He saw them a few feet away, huddled on the ground. They were alive, dazed, terrified, but alive. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He scrambled to them, his firefighter instincts kicking in alongside the military ones. "Are you hurt? Can you move?" he asked, his hands checking them for injuries with a practiced efficiency. "I think so," she stammered, her eyes wide with shock. "What was that?" "A bomb," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He knew. He had seen the aftermath of IEDs before. He knew the signature of manufactured chaos. He helped Sarah and David to their feet, pulling them away from the street towards the relative cover of a sturdy brick building. The street was a war zone. People were running in every direction, their faces masks of terror. Then, through the smoke and the chaos, he saw it. A secondary threat his soldiers' eyes picked out instantly. A nearby building, its structural integrity compromised by the blast, was groaning. A large section of its facade, a heavy concrete awning, was visibly cracked and shifting. And directly beneath it, a small group of people were frozen in panic, including a mother trying to shield her young child. They were in the kill zone. They were going to be crushed. There was no time to think. There was only time to act. "Stay here," he yelled to Sarah and David, his voice an order that could not be disobeyed. "Don't move." He turned and ran. He ran back into the danger, back into the smoke. He was no longer a husband or a father. He was a firefighter. He was a soldier. He was a man running into a burning building because that's what he was built to do. He reached the small group, shoving them, screaming at them to move, to run, pointing at the groaning concrete above. They stared at him, their minds too clouded by shock to understand. He heard a deafening crack from above. He looked up and saw the awning begin to peel away from the building in horrifying slow motion. There was no time. With the last of his strength, he gave the mother and child a final desperate shove, sending them sprawling out of the way, just as the sky began to fall. From the safety of the alley, Sarah and David could only watch in horror. They saw him push the others to safety. They saw him look up. And they saw him disappear under a tidal wave of concrete and dust. They screamed his name. But the only answer was the roar of the collapsing building, and then a terrible, deafening silence. The aftermath of the bombing was a scar carved into the heart of the city. For weeks, the news was a relentless cycle of grief and investigation. The number of victims, the stories of the lives lost, the grainy security footage of the van, and the endless, desperate question, why? Sergeant Mark Rylance, retired, was declared a hero. His final act of selfless bravery, pushing strangers out of harm's way at the cost of his own life, was a small, bright light in a story of overwhelming darkness. His picture was on every channel, a smiling man in a firefighter's uniform, a symbol of the good that evil can never truly extinguish. For his family, this heroism was a cold, bitter comfort. They didn't want a hero. They wanted their husband, their father. The investigation moved with a grim, methodical pace. Faces of suspects were plastered across the news. A network of extremists, a cell operating in the shadows. And at the center of it all, a face that meant nothing to the millions who saw it, but would have meant everything to the one man who could no longer see. The ringleader, the man who had parked the van, was identified. His name was Khalil. He had been killed in a raid a few days after the attack, leaving behind a trail of radicalized manifestos and a ghost of a backstory. The news report sketched out his life in broad, detached strokes. An orphan of the war, recruited by extremists as a boy, raised in a camp where hatred was the only curriculum. He was portrayed as a monster born from the ashes of a forgotten conflict, a faceless symbol of the enemy. One evening, weeks after the attack, a government official and the military liaison came to Sarah Rylance's house. They sat awkwardly in her living room, a room still filled with the ghost of her husband's presence. They had come to offer condolences and to deliver the contents of a box found in the terrorist's last known hideout. "We believe he was tracking your husband," the official said, his voice soft and clinical. "We don't know why he was singled out. Maybe he was just a symbol, a former soldier. We may never know for sure." The box contained a mess of papers, maps, and photographs. Most of it was intelligence, plans for future attacks. But there was one thing that was different, a small tattered, leather-bound journal. It was Khalil's. Later that night, long after the officials had left, Sarah Rylance sat alone, the journal in her hands. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to open it. She needed to understand the man who had taken her husband from her. She needed to look into the face of the monster. The journal was filled with angry, hate-filled rants, religious dogma twisted into a justification for murder. But as she read, going further and further back in time, the tone began to change. The angry man became a bitter teenager. The teenager became a confused, lonely boy. And then she found it. The very first entry. Written in the clumsy, sprawling handwriting of a child who had just learned to write in a new language. The page was dated 20 years ago. The entry wasn't about hate. It was about fear. It described a day of fire and screaming, the death of his parents, the terror of hiding. And then it described a monster. A giant soldier in a strange uniform, with a gun as big as his whole body. It described the moment the monster found him, hiding in a crate. The moment he looked down the barrel of the gun and prepared to die. And then the entry described a miracle. He did not shoot, the child had written. He had the eyes of my father, but he was the enemy. He looked at me. He put his finger on his mouth. He said, "Shh." He let me live. I don't know why. I will never forget his face. He was a monster, but he showed me mercy. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart turned to ice. Tucked into the back of the journal was a single, crudely drawn sketch. A child's drawing. It was a picture of a soldier's face remembered through the lens of terror and confusion. The helmet was too big. The features were distorted. But the eyes. She would know those eyes anywhere. They were her husband's. The monster who had spared him and the hero who had died in his attack were the same man. The boy he had saved had grown up to kill him. Sarah sat in the silence of her home, the journal lying open in her lap. The world, which had already been shattered, was now ground into a fine, unrecognizable dust. The simple, tragic story she had been telling herself. A good man killed by a faceless evil was a lie. The truth was a tangled, cruel, and unbearable knot. The monster wasn't a monster, and the hero's final act of goodness had been to die at the hands of the one life he had chosen to save. The irony was a poison, seeping into every memory she had of her husband. His quiet struggles with the war, the nightmares that haunted him, the silent weight he carried for 2 decades. It was all for this. He had carried the ghost of that boy with him every single day, holding on to that single act of mercy as proof that he was still a good man. And that boy, carrying the ghost of a merciful soldier, had twisted that memory into a justification for his own monstrous path. Perhaps, in his mind, the mercy he was shown was a moment of weakness, a flaw in the enemy that he would never replicate, a lesson in the importance of being ruthless. Or perhaps he never thought of it at all. Perhaps the boy who was saved died long ago in a training camp, and the man he became no longer remembered the feeling of a soldier's mercy. Sarah thought about the question that had plagued the news for weeks. Why? Why this city? Why this street festival? The investigators had assumed it was random, a target of opportunity. But now she knew it wasn't. She flipped through the box of intelligence the officials had left. Her eyes scanned the maps, the notes, and she saw it. A small circled address on a city map. It was a fire station, the one Mark had worked at for 15 years. Next to it, a handwritten note. The hero who saves people. He hadn't been tracking a random ex-soldier. He had been tracking a local hero. He had been studying his target. He must have seen Mark's face in the local paper at some point, a photo from a charity event or a community barbecue. And he must have recognized him. The face from his nightmares. The monster from the hovel. Khalil had discovered that the merciful soldier from his past had become a beloved hero in the heart of the enemy's world. And the cognitive dissonance, the sheer unbearable contradiction of it, must have broken something inside his hate-filled mind. The man who was supposed to be a monster was a hero. The symbol of evil was a symbol of good. The attack wasn't random. It was personal. It was an execution, a twisted, desperate act to kill a memory, to destroy a symbol that complicated the simple, hateful story he had built his entire life upon. He wasn't just bombing a city. He was bombing his own past. He was trying to kill the ghost of the good man who had let him live. The final bitter question hung in the air, unspoken and unanswerable. Was Mark wrong to save him? If he had followed orders, if he had pulled the trigger, dozens of innocent people, including himself and his own son, would still be alive. His one act of humanity had resulted in an unimaginable act of inhumanity. His one moment of moral clarity had created a future of absolute moral chaos. But if he had pulled the trigger, he would have become the monster the boy believed him to be. He would have killed the man inside the soldier's uniform. He would have come home a different person. Perhaps a person who couldn't have built the beautiful life he had. There was no answer. There was no good, no evil. Just a story of two soldiers on opposite sides of a war that never ended. One was taught to kill, but chose mercy. The other was shown mercy and chose to kill. And in the end, the war had taken them both, leaving behind nothing but the smoking wreckage of good intentions and the question that would haunt the living forever.